Honda UK were kind enough to lend me one of their CB650Rs for a couple of weeks, and after putting some decent miles on it both in and out of town, I've come to the conclusion that £6,999 represents pretty awesome value for money, so here's why. Let's start with the motor, which is a unique proposition in this market. It's powered by a 649cc liquid-cooled inline-4, whereas pretty much every other Japanese budget middleweight uses a twin-cylinder configuration. There's the MT-07 and XSR from Yamaha with a parallel twin on a 270-degree firing order, which gives it a nice sound, or the Kawasaki Z650, which is also a parallel twin, but on a 180-degree crank that gives it a bit more of a tractor note. And then you've got Suzuki's trusty SV650, which uses a V-twin. In practice, these bikes produce more torque lower down the rev range than the Honda, especially the Yamahas. But the CB650R can rev significantly higher, which means it produces a peak power of 94 horsepower at 12,000 RPM. That's about 20 more than the MT-07 and SV650 and 25 horsepower more than the Kawasaki. Combined with a reasonable curb weight of 202 kilograms, it makes for a pretty snappy ride at this price point, especially when you get the revs up into that peak range. I've loved on the sort of little bits of motorway that I've been riding on to get here, just when you're merging on and you go, you're coming off a roundabout from some traffic lights and get to go up to 70, then you can start to hit the top of the rev range and, really start to enjoy it. And like when you get onto these little country lanes up here, I mean, I always say it really depends on what you're used to. But 92 horses and a couple hundred kilos, not to be sniffed at. And especially combined with this optional quick shifter, which is only on the upshifts, but makes for a super addictive acceleration. It's just bang it down in second and woo! So it's a lot of fun when you're out on the open road, but realistically a bike at this price is a tempting choice of workhorse for commuters too. If you finance one monthly, as many folks do now, it's a pretty affordable and quick way to get around town. But is a zippy inline 4 the right choice for urban riding, or is it too gutless at low revs? I mean, you might expect an inline 4 like this, a 650cc, to need revving all the time and to get bogged down when the revs are low and when you're in traffic like this. And I certainly remember my Kawasaki ER6N, which came before the current Z650, which is a direct competitor of this bike. That, despite being a twin, and you'd think it had a bit more torque, I remember that would get a bit lumpy if you didn't, keep on top of the revs and get them up above 3,000 or 4,000 revs. But this feels quite smooth pulling away. But yeah, it's really a really easy ride around town. And then as soon as you get into the mid-range, it's got a snarl to the exhaust, a bit of a growl. The sort of like constant hum starts to break up a bit and sound a bit more aggressive, like it's distorted. And then once you get up to 4,000 or 5,000 revs, it does start to pull. I mean, you're not getting that top end rush that this bike's capable of, but there's enough there for getting around London anyway. Putting in some commuting miles on the CB left me with a good impression of Honda's renowned build quality, which doesn't suffer even on a modestly priced model such as this. The gearbox, for example, feels light and precise. Sometimes it takes me a little while to gel with a press bike in this area, but I felt at home right away on this machine. The slip assist clutch also gives a light lever feel, which makes a noticeable difference to your comfort on the bike when you spend a lot of time at the lights with the clutch pulled in or feathering it through slow-moving traffic. There's a quick shifter on the upshift available as an accessory, which is a nice addition for quicker riding. Although I can't say I used it much in town, it's always fun when you hit a straight piece of clear road to rip through the gears. A blipper would be nice on the downshift, but then again you have to remember the price. I also like the note of the stock exhaust. Of course, it's one of the first things that most of us look at changing, but this can is nice and quiet at tickover, which is actually preferable for me when you're doing a lot of town commuting. It then starts to distort and snarl in the mid-range, and there's a satisfying scream when you really wind it on. It's very nice indeed. Another premium feature of the CB when you compare it to the market is its upside-down Showa forks, whereas the other Japanese middleweights I mentioned above use conventional forks. For those of you not familiar, upside-down forks should generally give a better ride owing to the fact that there's less unsprung weight. They also provide more rigidity because the larger diameter tubing is used at the top of the forks, where most of the stress is felt from braking and turning forces. These Showa units are non-adjustable, but given the price point, that's understandable, and they feel nicely set up for a combination of practical riding and occasionally a more spirited pace. To me, it felt like Honda had hit a nice balance. It also has to be said that gold anodized upside-down forks are a bit of a look for naked and sporty bikes at the moment. Although they're not to everybody's taste, I think they do make the front end look more stocky, substantial and sporty than the MT, SV or Z650. There are 10 stages of preload adjustment on the monoshock so that you can account for a pillion or luggage, and it's attached to a beautifully cast aluminium swing arm. The yellow finish on the shock also adds a subtle touch of sportiness to the rear end and ties in nicely with the gold forks. Braking is another area in which the CB sets itself apart from the rest of the market with 4-pot radially mounted calipers on 310mm discs. All of the competition use conventionally mounted calipers on smaller discs, with only the Yamahas also using 4 pistons and the other bikes employing only 2. Radially mounted calipers attach to the forks with bolts that are parallel to the disc, whereas conventional calipers have bolts that are perpendicular. This translates to a more rigid mount for the radials, which gives the rider a crisper feel at the lever. The 4-pot brakes on the CB are provided by Nissin, which could be a disappointment for some buyers looking for premium branded brakes like Brembo, but at this price I'd rather see top-spec Nissin brakes, which are perfectly well made, than a lower-spec caliper where you're paying for the brand. On the road I found these brakes to be a nice balance of sharp but friendly. You know, the brakes, as I've said, they're not like super sharp, but given what you'll get elsewhere in this market, they're pretty damn good. You might not want them to be like ridiculously sharp in town anyway. Assuming that people are going to put a bit of miles in traffic on it, then yeah, like very harsh biting brakes are probably not ideal. But there's plenty of stopping power, especially in the front. Yeah, it's spot on and really nice and progressive. There's a sort of very easy first few millimeters in the lever pull there, and then after that it just gets more and more. The single pot rear brake is also from Nissin and is perfectly adequate. The CB comes with ABS as standard and it isn't switchable. That leads me nicely onto the electronics on this bike. There aren't any riding modes to speak of as it still uses a cable throttle as opposed to ride-by-wire. Honda's torque control, which is essentially their name for traction control, is present and switchable, so given that the ABS is always on, TC is your only adjustment when it comes to rider aids. Personally, I think it's sufficient for what the majority of riders will use this bike for. At £6,999, I'd rather Honda spend the manufacturing and development budgets on getting the best power and equipment for my buck, rather than having a load of electronics on a less capable bike. And I'm sure many of you'll agree because I often get comments from bikers who don't really care for electronics and prefer a more old school biking experience. I can see the merits of technology too, and I love my gadgets, but when the budget is limited, I'd rather it went on good mechanical components. Elsewhere electronically, there's a simple squared off dash which uses a negative LCD, i.e. a black background with white characters. In reading up about the bike before I collected it, I found a number of complaints about the visibility of this dash in bright conditions. October in the UK is typically dull and grey, so I didn't find it too much of a problem, but you can see what they mean in the footage here. It does catch the light. I loved the large white shift light at the top right. It adds a bit of a sporting feel to go along with the screaming inline-4 engine, but I wasn't such a fan of the fuel warning. I'm used to a big yellow light when I'm into the reserve, but the CB has a subtle flashing symbol in the LCD display, which went unnoticed a few times until I was home and putting the bike away. Fortunately, I didn't run it empty, but I might have been close on both occasions. LED lighting is used all around, with the headlight particularly distinctive and modern. But here lies another niggle with this bike. The front indicators are always on as daytime running lights, albeit at half brightness. It's a bit weird, potentially confusing for other road users, and when you see your reflection in a car or window, it can make you think you've left your indicators on. It's an unusual design decision that I've not encountered on any other bike. Perhaps there's a mod to override it, or maybe you could just live with it, but I think I'd rather they were just off. On the other hand, Honda's emergency brake light system, which flashes the lights under hard braking, makes total sense from a safety perspective and is a nice addition. To round off the electronics, heated grips are available as an option with 3 levels of toastiness, and level 1 in autumn is just about right to take the edge off the weather. For me, Honda did a great job of the styling on this bike, and that's another area in which it stands out in the market. It inherits some of the Neo Cafe styling cues from its bigger sibling, the CB650R, as well as the smaller capacity variants in this line. It's a subjective matter, but I prefer the hints of retro on the CB to something completely angular like the MT-07. That said, Yamaha have done a lovely job of converting it into a retro with the XSR 700, which runs the Honda close in terms of aesthetics. I love the stubby front end and round headlight, and the short tail would look equally mean with a decent tail tidy. In fact, some bar end mirrors also wouldn't go amiss while we're at it. The mix of gloss and matte finishes in black, brushed metal and a bronzy gold works surprisingly well together and gives it a premium feel that might not be present if the engine casing and wheels were just flat black. Overall, Honda have achieved something special by taking the quite generic looking previous model, the CB650F, and reworking the looks into a much more distinctive and classy package. So was there anything I didn't like? Aside from the aforementioned fuel warning and the always-on indicators, not really. I'd definitely check out the XSR2 if I was shopping in this market. It's a bit lighter and torquier low down, so depending on the type of riding you're doing, it might make more sense. But all in all, £6,999 seems like a bargain for this bike. Yes, the competition that I've listed is cheaper, but if you tried to get that 20 horsepower advantage out of a lesser bike with only an £800 budget, you'd be struggling. And then there's the better suspension and better brakes to boot. So if you're considering a Japanese middleweight naked bike, I'd strongly recommend that you make sure you take one of these out for a spin.